Probably.
Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Good morning. Welcome. It's Rochester Today with Tom Ostrom because it is Tuesday. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Andy.
Good to see you again.
You too.
Your team did well on Sunday.
Yes. You had a bye week, I think, right?
Yep. So
yeah,
Vikings.
Yeah, that Love is really something. Gosh, he can run, he can pass, and he does well.
I am worried. I'm worried about the Vikings next week with Detroit. They have just been steamrolling everybody they've been playing. So
I'm kind of glad for them. They've had so many years of losing games with high scores, but by a few points in the end, and it's kind of nice to see them doing well, but surprisingly so.
Well, they did well last year. They went quite a ways in the playoffs before they lost, so they have a lot of talent on that team, that's for sure.
You bet.
Okay.
Well, so do the Vikes, so we'll be watching them next week.
I will, yeah, for sure. It'll be, imagine in Minnesota, it will be a highly rated television program.
You bet. You bet.
To say the least. What's on the mailbag, Tom?
The Babylon Bee, the political satirists. Democrats are considering replacing Kamala Harris with the more coherent and lucid Joe Biden. Following the vice president's widely criticized pre-taped interview with CNN, reports circulated Democrats are thinking of replacing her with Joe. Harris's joint interview with Walz was met with poor reviews. Harris's inability to provide cogent answers, and a Democrat who remains anonymous said, "We gave Kamala a try, but she just does not display the same mental capacity and clear communication skills comparatively with Joe Biden."
That was the Babylon Bee again, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Satire. And
then from the Bee also, Nevada Dan sent me this one from the Bee. Experts say, and this might be one of their satirical comments that is accurate also, but the Babylon Bee says, experts say that Kamala can still win if she doesn't appear in public again between now and election day. And then a rather lengthy analysis by Randy. He's so articulate and does his research and has this for us. Hi, Tom. Hope you and Andy are well. A bit of geopolitics for you. Benjamin Netanyahu is unmatched in his implementation and innovation of skills in modern warfare. The assassination of his enemy leaders, the remote detonation of pagers and walkie-talkies carried by Hezbollah members are recent examples. He's been measured in his responses to Iran. That will come later. Netanyahu and the Biden administration have had a tense relationship. Biden has helped with weaponry, but yet wants a two-state solution and criticizes the Gaza war. Netanyahu may be planning an October supplies on Iran and its nuclear facilities. Missteps in all of the conflict between the two nations. This volatile region has yet to have more surprises. And energy prices could be affected depending on what happens before the election. And then Randy continues, Netanyahu is working to remove an existential threat to the Middle East, Iran. Israel has done much with little or no help from other nations and criticism from the Biden administration while it works to remove Iran. And Arab nations want that done, even though they might not say it publicly. And again, Iranians are not Arab, they're Persian, so that's been a source of conflict. Biden's mixed messages have been sympathetic sometimes to Israel's adversaries, and the demands for a Gaza ceasefire and two-state solution is unlikely. Netanyahu does not favor that, and so that's an interesting and complete analysis.
It is, and I agree with much of what he said. And I think, we could talk about that more in international affairs too, but I think that the push for a two-state solution is dead in the water for at least the near term. I don't think that there is any interest among the Israelis in pursuing a two-state solution, even those who are more dovish than Netanyahu. I think their concern in the aftermath of October 7th of last year is security more than it is diplomacy at this point, because I think what you've seen happening in the Middle East is a complete failure of diplomacy. But we can talk about that later.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it for the mailbag?
That's it.
Okay. We'll take a break. Back in a moment. Tom Ostrom, I'm Andy Brownell, and this is Rochester Today. News Talk 1340, KROC AM at 96.
Paul Trombley.
Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Welcome back. More of Rochester Today, Tuesday morning with T.O. Tom Ostrom. I'm Andy Brownell, and Minnesota News is what we're talking about today. What do you want to start with, Tom?
From Breitbart, Tim Walz bragged about the mass immigration that was overwhelming Minnesota towns and schools with language issues and all kinds of other issues, and Walz calls it a beautiful diversity. Like Worthington, Minnesota, with fewer than 14,000 residents, the town's taxpayers were forced to hike taxes to the sum of tens of millions because of the rapid increase in migrant children enrolling and unaccompanied alien children that have to be taken care of. And Walz just thought that was wonderful. The chaos that's in the Worthington school, Walz said, according to Breitbart, this is a beautiful diversity we see out of Worthington. They have over 50 languages being spoken in their school. Every storefront is filled with different types of foods and businesses, and Minnesota needs to continue to do that. And so one of several states, Minnesota, is spending all kinds of money on American English. English is a second language, and English learners. And then Breitbart goes on, John Binder, from 2019 to 2022, the percentage of fourth graders in Minnesota who are not proficient in reading has increased from 62% to almost 70%. And likewise, eighth graders not proficient in math increased from 56% to 70% in Minnesota. And plus, he says this, I didn't know this either, perhaps most alarming, almost a third of all students in the state were deemed chronically absent in the 2021-22 school year, meaning they missed more than 10% of their school days. Well, that costs the school districts money. When there's absent rates, they get less money from the state.
And it's a complicated scenario for sure. And the influx of immigrants has put a strain on school districts throughout Minnesota. There's no doubt about it. But I would, to counter what Breitbart's version of that, I would look at Worthington, and you see Worthington prior to the influx of immigrants into the community as, I don't know, a slowly dying community. A lot of those small towns in southwestern Minnesota and even south central Minnesota have been just bleeding population over the last couple decades as fewer and fewer agricultural related jobs are available, and the main streets have died down as the big boxes in the major centers, although Worthington would be considered a regional center in that part of the world.
Yeah,
a lot of young people have now made homes in these smaller communities in southwestern Minnesota that has provided them with some vibrancy, but at the same time has made things a lot more complex and a lot, you're right, there's a lot of strain on the system.
And Breitbart says that Worthington has a population of fewer than 14,000 residents.
Yeah. But out in that part of the world, that's actually one of the bigger cities.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got Redwood Falls, which is larger. You have Marshall, and you have Worthington. There's not a lot of big towns until you get to Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Okay. Let's see. From Mike LaChance, a journalist, Tim Walz gets tongue-tied as he tries to walk back comments about eliminating the Electoral College after being contradicted by the Harris campaign that said we are not in favor of eliminating the Electoral College. So the article says Walz is walking a dumpster fire, and the Harris campaign knows now that he's quite problematic. He's been calling for an end to the Electoral College. When the Harris campaign was asked about it, they told the media that's not their official position. So then Walz was asked about that on ABC News, and he looked like a deer in the headlights as he tried to backtrack and then saying, "Well, yeah, the campaign doesn't support that, but I've been clear, and my position is the campaign's position." And then at a fundraiser, California Governor Newsom, at his private residence, Walz said the Electoral College system needs to go in favor of a national popular vote. And
he signed legislation that more or less puts Minnesota on that path, depending on a variety of different scenarios.
That's right. And then he was asked about that on ABC News, his statements and the Harris campaign statements. And so then he said this, well, there's a lot of folks that feel every vote must count in every state. And then
that's such a nonsensical statement.
And then the article reminds us that Democrats don't like the Electoral College because, quote, it prevents our elections from being decided by liberals in New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And Walz and many other Democrats do want to get rid of it.
And, I know it's received a fair amount of publicity over the past 3 or 4 days, but a lot of folks are still unaware that during the previous legislative session, the 2023 session, where the so-called trifecta in government with the Democrats in control passed all sorts of initiatives and erased our $19 billion deficit, or I'm sorry, I really misspoke there, surplus. One piece of legislation that was snuck into one of those omnibus bills, I wouldn't say snuck into it, but was included in it, was Minnesota's enrollment in what's called the Popular Vote Compact. And it's perfectly legal. States get to decide how to apportion their electoral college votes. There are different options on doing it. Minnesota currently is a winner-take-all. So if the Democrat presidential candidate wins the majority of votes in the state of Minnesota, that candidate will get all of Minnesota's electoral college votes. I believe Maine and Nebraska do it differently. You could have individual congressional districts assigned electoral votes. So if the candidate in the first district is the Republican, let's say, but in the second district it's the Democrat, the elector from the first district would be casting their vote for the Republican candidate. So you could end up with, in the state of Minnesota, with our, 8 congressional districts, you could have 4 of them casting their votes for the Republican and 4 casting their vote for the Democrat, depending on how the vote goes, particularly with our purple state. Although we're bluer and blue because of the urban concentration of votes in the Twin Cities. This is getting a little long-winded, so I'm going to try to wrap it up. But what Walz and the Democrats have proposed is that Minnesota and other participating states would pledge all of their Electoral College votes to whichever candidate wins the popular vote nationally, regardless of what the vote is in Minnesota. So if a Republican were to get the most votes nationwide, Minnesota, despite its history of voting Democrat, would cast its electoral votes for the Republican or vice versa. Now, it won't happen until enough states sign on to have 270 Electoral College votes. And I give that a snowball's chance and of actually happening.
Yeah. And that would deprive people theoretically a lot of
I agree. I think it's votes. But it's a way to get around the Constitution. Well, it's not a way to get around the Constitution because it's perfectly constitutional to do this. The states can do this if they wish to. But it's an easier way to do it than amending the U.S. Constitution.
I wonder if it is constitutional. It does tamper with the Electoral College system.
No, it really doesn't, because the states can decide how to do what they want to do with their Electoral College votes.
Yeah, but it makes it quite unpredictable, too.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I don't think most people are supportive of it either, by the way.
No.
Or even were aware of it.
Right. I don't know how much time we have. My next item is quite extensive.
Okay, go ahead. We'll make it work.
Okay. Haley Phelan is a journalist, writes for the Minnesota Sun, the Wisconsin Daily Star, and Alpha News. And Fox News used the findings of that article, and it boils down to this. A database reveals 382 Minnesota kids have received sex change-related medical interventions in the last 5 years, and that Minnesota hospitals have provided surgical interventions to 174 pediatric child patients. And children, I'm not going to name hospitals because this group that has compiled this information has been powerful enough, and we'll name it a little bit. Stop the Harm database is the source of this, and some medical units have stopped these procedures because of this group putting pressure on them. So we're not going to name any hospitals in this article because of that complexity. It's called Stop the Harm database, and it's a do no harm group. It highlights hospitals that have provided puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and sex change surgeries to children in the last few years from 2019 on. It's called Stop the Harm database. Documents over 13,000 minors have received gender transition treatments across the United States, including almost 6,000 surgeries, 62,000 hormone puberty blockers. In Minnesota, Do No Harm said its database reveals that 382 Minnesota children received sex change-related interventions with, and I'm not going to name, now then they start listing hospitals. I'm trying to avoid saying it when they name these hospitals so many times here. The database says Minnesota hospitals have provided surgical interventions to 174 pediatric patients, puberty blockers and hormones to 219, and it's generated over $2 million in billing claims. And that's how the organization found out about this. They got the claims from insurance companies, so that's where they got their data. I don't know how insurance companies would release that, but evidently they did. And let's see, the watchdog group founded in 2022 said these procedures are experimental. They do irreversible harm. Dr. Stanley Goldfarb is the chairman of Do No Harm, and they've contacted different institutions and been effective in some of them stopping these things. And it says these are dangers in experimental gender medicine. And said Dr. Goldfarb, we have to bring this to an end. It's uncertain and it's and its repercussions. And a prominent detransitioner who received a double mastectomy is on the board. Excuse me. And that said these procedures are dishonest and they're harmful. And Minnesota state legislators Andrew Matthews and Walter Hudson have expressed concern of the findings and these gender-affirming treatments. And Alpha News contacted some of the hospitals named, and none of them responded. And we'll just say these trans refuge bills are harmful, and that Minnesota is a trans refuge state. Governor Walz has welcomed children into the state for those procedures if they can't get them in their own states.
Okay. We'll take a break for news. Come back in just a moment. I'll talk about some of the polling numbers on that particular issue when we get back.
Mm-hmm.
After the news break with Tom Ostrom, I'm Andy Brownell, and this is Rochester Today on News Talk 1340, KROC AM at 96 FM. Good morning. Welcome back. The news break. Andy Brownell with Tom Ostrom, Rochester Today, Tuesday morning. We went into the break. You were reading off some numbers concerning children and trans medical procedures. And I said the polling numbers, and I read a recent article over the weekend about how the polling numbers are not favoring the Democrats on this issue particularly. Both medical interventions for children and transgender athletic conflicts. That strong majorities oppose allowing children to undergo trans medical interventions. I'm trying to remember the exact term used, but that accurately describes it. And majorities also do not believe that biological males should be allowed to compete against biological females in athletic events. And regarding the children medical interventions, it's a majority across the board. Slim majorities for some demographics, very large majorities for others. And obviously, I would say that among men, there's a stronger majority opposing childhood interventions than women, but there's still majorities for women, and even young voters who you would think might be supportive of trans surgeries for children, or at least neutral on it. It's still a slight majority favor a ban of those types of procedures.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the Republicans are making hay out of this issue with their national commercials. And they seem to be fairly effective on this certain political point. And the Democrats' pursuit of that agenda, according to these polls, may harm them come November 5th.
Yeah, that and the border issues and,
the border issue has now been elevated to the number one issue.
Yeah.
Even above the economy, which that caught me by surprise.
Yeah. And then the masculine vote, too, is being lost. So they're trying to make Walz their epitome of masculinity. But, you know, there's a visual of him hunting, was it for pheasants or whatever nowadays?
Yeah, it was a pheasant opener last weekend.
Yeah, and it showed him having a heck of a time getting shells into his shotgun.
I did, fine. You criticize whatever, but I did hear one of the national talking heads, more or less saying, "Why is Walz taking time off the campaign trail to go hunting for pheasants? He should be busy." I thought, well, the pheasant opener is kind of a big deal in Minnesota, so yeah. I think he would feel obligated to participate because he was the one, I think, who started it in the first place because he's not such a big fisherman. He wanted to go pheasant hunting.
Yeah. But some people say it's the Democrats trying to appeal to masculine voters who are slipping away, just like black voters are. In fact, Obama went after black people, males, and criticized them And boy, the black males went back after him, talking and saying he's racist, saying what he demands. But anyway.
Along the same lines, quickly before we move on, when we're talking about polling, there was a prominent California Democrat who was a longtime state legislator, and she's now endorsed Trump, and she's a Hispanic woman. I found it funny just because I have a close relation who is Hispanic, and it rings true what she said. As she was speaking at this rally in California with Trump over the weekend, she was one of the speakers, and pointing out that in California at least, and I wouldn't doubt that it would be nationwide eventually, there's a push to ban the use of gas stoves in homes for climate change reasons. And of the Hispanics I know closely, they will never go to an electric burning stove because they just don't do the right kind of job when you're making tortillas. and this former lawmaker brought that up to the crowd, and you know what? That's right on, because I've heard that more than a few times, because I have an electric range in my house, and I've been belittled because you can't properly make a tortilla on an electric range. And I love tortillas, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Okay. The Justice Department a few days ago unsealed an indictment against an Afghan national living in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, for conspiring to conduct an election day terrorist attack in the United States on behalf of the Islamic State of Iraq and ISIS. And so this Justice Department press release, they named the person and a co-conspirator, a relative immigrant, and they had AK-47 rifles and ammunition and were ready to do that attack. And the authorities found out about him and intervened and traced him and arrested him. And Attorney General Merrick Garland said in a press release, the defendant, motivated by ISIS, conspired to the violent attack. And FBI Director Chris Wray said this defendant was motivated by ISIS, and FBI assets intervened and headed this off. But that's again evidently a cost of open borders, but a close call.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason the immigration argument is becoming more and more prevalent as an issue in the election, is the idea that we don't know who we're allowing into the country. We're allowing probably a lot of really, 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 really good people into the country. But amongst that cohort, statistically, there has to be some bad characters as well.
Mm-hmm. Republicans are concerned in the red states that were flooded and have had these disasters that will Republicans have access to voting in a couple of weeks? Polls and getting to the polls and registration and identification. And the Republicans are trying to open up the voting process, ironically, and I think Democrats want to close it down, a reversal of their positions. But that could be a problem at election time.
Yeah, it could be very, very messy, particularly in Appalachia, where roads are completely washed out, bridges are gone, whole communities have been destroyed.
Yeah, and I wondered about this, too, with the horrible flooding and disaster and dislocation of people and infrastructure and assets. A friend of mine golfs in Florida, and you hear about alligators walking across golf courses next to water. And he sent me a snapshot of one that walked across the golf course green that he was on. And he got so close to it that he took a photo of it with his cell phone. And he was so close that he could spot that the alligator was missing a foot that had bitten off. And I wondered about that. And now they're saying displaced alligators are throwing chaos into the cleanup, into the flooded areas, that they're popping around and ending up on people's porches, for gosh sakes.
You know, once again, I would never move to Florida. After seeing this, I can't even imagine the attraction of it. The summers are miserable, hot, and muggy. You do get that winter time after the hurricane season through April, probably early May, where it's pretty darn nice. But then the heavy price that you have to pay to live down there when this sort of thing happens. I wonder how many people who have recently migrated to that state are having misgivings now and thinking about getting out, regardless of what the tax situation might be.
Yeah,
that's a lot of hardship. That's for sure.
Oh gosh, yeah, and then worrying it'll happen again in another hurricane season.
Well, it will happen again. It's just wind, right?
Yeah. Gosh.
Okay. Anything else national news, or should we take our break?
Well, I just want to mention this briefly if we pursue it in the next segment maybe, but this is a scandal. Allegedly, and former employees of 60 Minutes in that station say, yeah, and it's outrageous. We're embarrassed by it. That 60 Minutes allegedly edited Kamala Harris's interview to remove her gibberish and change answers to the questions, and they took taped statements she's made elsewhere and imposed it on the interview, but she didn't say in the interview. She didn't answer questions appropriately, and CBS is being accused of that professional malpractice, and people are pursuing it. They want the Federal Communications Commission to look at it. Democrats are saying nothing to see here. Republicans are saying this is a disgrace.
Wow. Well, if the allegations are true, it would be disgraceful. It's dishonest. So it'd be interesting to see what comes of this. And the other one is has this been common practice for 60 Minutes to do this in the past? Especially if you were to take a piece of an interview or a statement that was made that wasn't part of the interview and try to include that into what the viewer believes is the interview that's taking place for this program without some sort of disclaimer telling you that. Oh, by the way, excerpts of this interview are not from this interview. They're from statements made by Harris whenever she made them.
Yeah.
Then I think you could say, okay, at least you're being full disclosure and accountable. But if you're doing it this way, sleight of hand, that's completely dishonest.
And they're covering up for her inept answers. That's even election interference.
There's that term again, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take the break. Back in a moment with international news coverage. Always a lot happening there. And this is Rochester Today with Tom Ostrom. I'm Andy Brownell, News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.
Rochester Today with Andy Brownell and Tom Ostrom on News Talk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
Rochester Today, Tuesday morning with Tom Ostrom. I'm Andy Brownell. Tom, we have a few moments left to talk about foreign affairs. What's at the top of the agenda?
Pope Francis. This was some time ago. I've had it in my file. Haven't used it. Pope Francis told journalists a while back that Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are both against life. Kamala Harris for her pro-abortion views, Trump for trying to stop immigration. And then it said to them, so they're both against people's lives. And one throws out migrants and one kills children, the Pope said.
Wow.
And whether that's election interference, I don't know, but I guess that's a faith and morals question that he can, excuse me, that he's concerned about. And he said abortion is murder, and we don't condone it. And sending migrants away, not letting them have a life, is cruelty. The orphan, the stranger, the widow cannot be forgotten.
I don't know if I've heard him speak that strongly on the abortion issue before. It seems like he could have leveled that criticism at Joe Biden, and I don't think I ever heard him do that.
That's right. He has never criticized Biden publicly for anything.
And Biden being a practicing Catholic.
That we've heard. Yeah, that's a good point, Andy. Ukraine President Zelensky says that he's trying to prepare a peace plan for November because he's aware that Trump might become president, and he has discussed this with Trump when he was in the United States. Trump wants that war to end. Zelensky wants more weapons to end the war. But he says he's working on a peace plan, would like the war to be over next year, and he's going to share it with Trump and Harris when he returns to the United States, and that he needs energy safety and food security and territorial integrity, and that's what he wants.
Okay. I wish that would come sooner than later, that's for sure.
Yeah, right.
Whether or not Putin will play, I don't have any clue.
Yeah. And by the way, Putin, the dictator of Russia, he cemented ties with the Iranian president, the Ayatollah, and Putin recently met and shook hands, and Iran supports Russia. Putin says that. And then North Korea has announced again further support of Russia, and even the possibility of sending North Korean troops in to help the Russians, but certainly sending military supplies. But that is really Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian met Putin recently, and the Iranians are telling the West, the United States and others, to stay out of the Middle East affairs and stay out of whether Iran and Netanyahu of Israel has reminded that the United States has lost lots of soldiers over the decades thanks to the Iranians, and now the Iranians are saying they want to assassinate our president, and Iran is saying to the U.S., stay out of this Middle East problem with Israel. We'll cope with them on our own, so get lost. And so, my gosh, the arrogance of the Iranians.
Well, the danger of the Iranians and this alliance being formed and strengthening between the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans, and potentially the Chinese, should be very worrisome to anybody in the Western world, not just the United States. It's diametrically opposed to our values and our interests. And Iranians possessing a nuclear weapon should scare the heck out of everybody. And I did see that Kamala Harris, when asked about the biggest threat facing the U.S., I know she's actually been criticized a little bit for this, but she identified the Iranians and said that she would be dedicated to not allowing the Iranians to obtain nuclear weapons, which I find a little bit ironic because when she was with the Biden administration, they were continuously trying to resurrect the Iranian nuclear treaty that was put in place by Obama, which proved remarkably ineffectual, and they were cheating on constantly. And I think that history will judge it this way, that Trump's deterrence policies were more effective against the Iranians than the diplomatic channels that have been attempted during the Biden administration. And Iran's activities with Hezbollah and Gaza are probably the best examples of how they totally disregard any diplomatic agreements or approaches that you could possibly find. The war between Israel and Hezbollah from, 9 years ago? I can't remember exactly. When the UN brokered ceasefire occurred and peace occurred, the UN resolution strictly forbid Hezbollah from operating in southern Lebanon where they could pose a threat to the Israelis. And what has happened over the past year clearly shows how much they disregarded that completely and never at all ever followed the dictates of that resolution. The Israelis are finding caches of weapons, some of them heavy weapons, stored in homes all over the place in southern Lebanon, using them as base camps for the Hezbollah fighters who are raining missiles down on Israel and forcing the evacuation of communities. And once again, like we were talking last Thursday, this idea that the Israelis can sit down and negotiate seems, I don't know, fruitless because of who you're asking them to negotiate with. There's no reason to believe that they will act in good faith on any sort of ceasefire agreement or peace agreement.
And that is refreshing that Kamala has made the statement that you said regarding the threat that Iran poses, because as you mentioned, Obama was lenient with Iran and was said to have funneled Iran lots of money. But I've also read that the Biden administration has funneled money to Iran. So mixed messages.
Yeah, more recently, the Biden administration has tightened down sanctions on oil revenues for the Iranians. The idea that you would find an exemption that would allow the Iranians to have oil revenues seems a bit ridiculous in the first place, seeing as they're using the profits to fund terrorist activities against U.S. soldiers.
Yeah.
And I go with the Russians as well. The Russians have assets frozen throughout the world because of their invasion of Ukraine, with the exception of those dealing with energy production, which is what is funding the war effort against the Ukrainians. It seems nonsensical.
And I forget the details of the sources, but it's evidently and allegedly Iran is quite open with and maybe even has attempted to assassinate Trump. There are rumors that they're involved in that.
Well, I don't think there's rumors. I think the Justice Department has identified threats.
So, my goodness. If that happens, it's World War III with Iran.
The situation worldwide for the United States and our Western allies is more dangerous than it's been in a long time. Mm-hmm. And I think there are sane people out there on both sides of the political aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, who have been sounding the alarm bells, but nobody's listening.
Yeah.
We're not really doing anything about it. We're not ramping up production of armaments. We're not spending more on our military and preparations for the use of military to deter these actions. We're doing the exact opposite.
Mm-hmm. And we're giving our weaponry away to Ukraine, which our adversaries know.
Well, but some would argue that allowing the Ukrainians to fight the Russians will deplete the Russians' more capabilities just as badly as it is affecting ours. So, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, you know what? We're out of time. So,
okay.
We'll chat again Thursday.
Yeah.
Tom Ostrom. I'm Andy Brownell. Thanks, Tom. This is News Talk 1340, KROC AM, 96.9 FM, Rochester.